I want to start by acknowledging the excellent research assistance that we received on this project from Alexander Pinto, recent Elliott School graduate. Thank you for that. And of course, to thank Charlie and Carnegie for making the work possible. As Charlie mentioned at the outset, this is the second phase of a two-phase project that began with an analysis that looked at the long-term military prognosis for a U.S.-China competition in the Western Pacific centered around the capability of anti-access area denial technologies, collection of new missile guidance and sensor and surveillance technologies that are designed to deny hostile forces freedom of movement, and in principle, in the fear of some, enabling China, which has invested heavily in these technologies over the last generation or so, to potentially create an area denial bubble that could force the United States militarily out of the Western Pacific, potentially out as far as the second island chain at a distance of up to 3,000 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. The first product of this project was a paper that argued that the military technological prognosis in this race was not going to produce that kind of military hegemony for China in the region. That in fact what was likelier to emerge in the long run was a partition into spheres of influence in which both sides could control the airspace over and the sea surface near controlled land masses, but that neither side could control the entire theater, and that much of the South and East China Seas were likely to end up as no man's lands in which neither side had freedom of movement. The second phase of the project was designed to evaluate that argument, but in a much larger context. Not just the 2040 future that the first paper was aimed at drawing a projection out to, but look backwards into larger trends in the military history of war at sea, and look outwards beyond the regional context of the Western Pacific in that larger time frame, to ask to what degree do these findings about 2040 fit with any larger trends or any larger bodies of experience in the conduct of war at sea. And that brings us to the project that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. And in particular, we started this process by asking, what does the military effectiveness literature say that might help us generate answers to some of these questions? Political science in the last generation has produced a large and increasingly rich literature looking at the causes of a variety of military outcomes, casualty causation, winning and losing, the duration of battles, that's looked at a host of potential independent variables, ranging from the nature of technology in a war to the numerical balance of forces, the way forces are used, the structure of the societies, the ethnicities of the countries waging the war, their regime type, their alliance structure, the structure of the international system, and much, much more. Given this rather rich body of literature and the amount of thought that's gone into it, what should that tell us then about larger trends and patterns in the conduct of war at sea? And among the interesting features of that literature, however, as rich as it is almost silent on war at sea. It's focused overwhelmingly on conventional continental warfare, land forces and the air forces above them, secondarily on counterinsurgency. Things that float are essentially invisible in this literature. Now, there is a literature of its own on naval history and naval strategy, written by a very different disciplinary group, overwhelmingly historians, policy analysts, serving officers, scholars in the professional military education system, with conclusions and findings of its own that are largely separate and different from those of the political science literature on effectiveness, and that gave rise to the question, is the separation between these two literatures reflective of a difference in these two military domains that would justify the more or less hermetically sealed quality of these two stovepiped literatures? So we sought to address this question of, are these two military domains, the continental warfare domain that has gotten a great deal of political science attention, the maritime domain that has not, fundamentally different in their nature or their dynamics or their outcomes in ways that would make the rich political science literature on this irrelevant or not. And in particular, the way we went about trying to address that was by collecting data. And so we developed a new data set. We call it NavBattle, since in the way navies do acronyms is they don't do single letters, they do syllables, right? So so NavBattle seemed like the appropriate thing to call this. And we compiled data on all 445 great power surface naval battles from the dawn of the Age of Sail in the 17th century through the end of the last major great power naval war in 1945, and used these data to generate a series of comparisons with a comparable data set that the US Army had collected back in the 1980s and 1990s, CDB-90, that looked at 660 land battles between 1600 and about 1973. And the question we asked ourselves is, given this large body of observable empirical experience, how similar or how different are the domains of naval and continental warfare? And what, if anything, can we learn from the political science literature on land and continental warfare to understand the larger context of where we think naval warfare in the Western Pacific is going by 2040. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is sketch some of the findings of that comparative empirical analysis by looking at some of the major claims in the political science effectiveness literature about land warfare and asking, do they work at sea or not? And one of the most important of those claims in the extant literature on continental warfare has to do with the relative importance of material and non-material variables for outcomes. Our analysis of 2040 in the Western Pacific was driven by a particular claim about the way the technology, the material of war, is going to work. A central argument in the continental literature on land is that technology isn't enough. So we began by asking ourselves, let's take a look at the history of these two domains and ask, how frequently did the numerically superior side win? As a way of shedding some light on how important is the contribution of material superiority to outcomes. And the answer is it's quite different, actually. On land, about 59% of the time, from 1600 to 1973, the numerically superior side wins. At sea, the numerically superior side wins 68% of the time. In neither of these domains does the material explain all the variance, but it looks like material is more influential at sea, typically, than it is on land. What if we look at the duration of combat on land and combat on sea? And what I've done here is to take two plots from CDB-90 about land warfare and NavBattle in naval warfare. And I've presented a semi-log representation of the duration of battles over time between 1600 and 2000. Be careful, it's a semi-log scale, so differences vertically matter more than they might seem. And the short version of the implication of the comparison is that sea battles are radically shorter than land battles are. The median duration of a land battle over a several century span is about a day. The median duration of sea battles over the same period is about 1/10 of a day. Moreover, the trends in these two domains are opposite. In land war, especially since about 1900, the duration of combat has been increasing dramatically. In fact, the average duration of land battles in the 20th century, by comparison with the 17th century, has gone up by a factor of more than 8. At sea, the trend is precisely the opposite. As technology has advanced over the centuries, naval battles are getting ever shorter. The average duration of a naval battle since 1900 is about half what it was in the 17th century. What about another outcome that's been much talked about in the effectiveness literature? How destructive are battles on land and at sea? So let's consider the defeated side's loss rate. What percentage of the personnel engaged on land or the tonnage engaged on sea is destroyed, sunk, scuttled, captured, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner for land in these two domains. And once again, we see an important and substantial difference. At sea, defeated sides' median loss rate is 50% of the engaged tonnage. On land, it's about 20%. Moreover, at sea, there have been 23 instances in which the defeated side was utterly annihilated. Every last ship engaged sunk. There are no cases since 1600 in the Army's data set in which a land combatant suffered anything like 100% casualties. How about the one-sidedness of combat outcomes in these two domains? So what I've done here is to plot the loss exchange ratio, the casualties suffered by the high casualty side divided by the casualties suffered by the low casualty side, to produce an estimate of how imbalanced were combat outcomes. The higher the loss exchange ratio, the more one-sided the combat was. And once again, we see an important difference. The median loss exchange ratio at sea is about 5 to 1. The more damaged side loses 5 tons of combat power for every 1 ton of combat power that the other side loses. On land, it's in the neighborhood of 2. Now, just to summarize a variety of these kinds of comparisons before drawing some conclusions from that and conclusions from the conclusions for the future, and especially the issue of the military prognosis with China and the United States, what we see if we look at win percentage for the materially preponderant side, median battle duration, median loss rate, and median loss exchange ratio is that over a broad look at multiple centuries of empirical evidence, war at sea appears to be more materially influenced in its outcomes, shorter, more destructive, and more one-sided than war at land. And there's a reason for these apparent differences that stems from the unique military environment of the sea as a place to fight, as opposed to the land as a place to fight. The Earth's surface is an extremely complicated military environment. Trees, houses, hills, ravines, gullies, civilians. In this kind of extremely complex military environment, there is a lot of cover and concealment available for combatants who are able to exploit it to reduce their exposure to enemy fire. That tends to lower the destructiveness of warfare on land. It also tends to increase the duration of land warfare because the kinds of military tactics and operational concepts that land armies use to exploit all of this complexity of terrain for cover and concealment systematically slow down the pace of operations. Careful, elaborate advanced reconnaissance is necessary to exploit terrain for cover and concealment. Off-road circuitous movement is necessary to take covered approach routes to your objective. Elaborate preliminary suppressive fires can reduce your exposure during brief sprints from cover to cover. All of these things tend to slow land war, reduce the ability of land armies to kill the enemy quickly and in large numbers, and reduce the one-sidedness of the result relative to war in an environment in which the surface of the ocean, although not literally featureless, is by comparison with the surface of the land very nearly so, and in which it's almost uniformly trafficable in all directions for potentially thousands of miles. These features mean that it's often hard to find an opposing fleet to engage them at all in naval warfare because the ocean is so large. But if you are found, there is no cover, there is no concealment, and it's very hard to escape because your opponent can not only find you and attack you, but pursue you. And that tends to create much more destructive, much more one-sided, much faster moving military actions at sea. And these are trends that have held up and even accelerated over centuries of military experience. So what message should we draw then from that kind of broad brush comparison of centuries worth of military experience for the question at hand? Where is the military competition at the conventional level with China going? And what then does that mean for the dangers of escalation to the nuclear level that will emerge out of this kind of context? And I think there are a couple of points to keep in mind from that. The first one is anti-access area denial technology is going to create a very interestingly novel military problem for navies. Anti-access area denial is a fundamentally land-based capability. The kinds of sensor, but especially missile technologies that are at the heart of A2AD are mobile land-based capabilities. But they are mobile land-based capabilities that if they get anything remotely like the 3,000 kilometer reach that many now expect for this technology is going to increasingly affect war at sea out to distances that mean that any meaningful naval mission in the Western Pacific is going to be within the reach of one or both sides' land-based A2AD technology. And what that means is that the autonomy of naval warfare as a domain that has radically distinctive combat dynamics is systematically going down in the future. The era in which navies fight other navies at a remove from the land such that the dynamics you see in the right-hand column are what you can reasonably expect is under serious challenge in an era of A2AD. And if as a result of that we get, as I think one can expect, and certainly as our earlier paper would project, a combination of land-based cover and concealment and seagoing exposure, what you can easily end up with is an environment in which the classical naval expectation of quick, decisive, first mover advantage warfare is not going to be a good guide to future military experience in which much of this warfare is going to involve the kinds of dynamics that on land have classically produced a very different style of warfare with very different dynamics and very different outcomes. And that is, in an important sense, a reversal of trends that navies have seen and expected over centuries, which have been to increasingly destructive, increasingly one-sided, increasingly short-duration battle. They are now engaged in what, in a sense, can be described as a different kind of hybrid warfare than the hybrid warfare people classically talk about in places like Ukraine and the Baltics. Hybrid in the sense of a form of warfare that merges the military dynamics of land combat and sea combat in ways that put sea-based forces at radical disadvantage. Because the kind of exposure that's produced those kinds of dynamics will still be characteristic of things on the surface of the ocean. The kinds of concealment that have produced left-hand column dynamics historically will be characteristic of their assailants. And that suggests that expectations on the part of navies that decisive, destructive preemption of an A2AD threat will work the way decisive, destructive preemption has classically worked in naval warfare are probably mistaken. The business of finding, rooting out, and destroying what could be tens of thousands of mobile land-based anti-air and anti-ship missiles is not a project of ours. In the Battle of Midway, the United States Navy could cripple the Japanese fleet in a couple of hours of decisive, destructive warfare. That is not the domain that you can reasonably expect for naval warfare in coming generations. Now, that expectation, however, is based on an assumption that skill levels between the Navy and the A2AD force are roughly comparable. Another finding in the political science effectiveness literature, going back to this issue of the relative importance of material and non-material variables, is that non-material variables matter a lot. And a particular claim one encounters in that literature about the way non-material variables affect outcomes is that as technology on land has gotten increasingly lethal, what that has done is increasingly enable militaries to punish force employment mistakes deriving from inadequate skill on the other side, but that equally skilled forces that are mutually capable of exploiting the complexity of the Earth's surface for cover and concealment can reduce their vulnerability and create little change in outcomes. Over time, as technology has gotten more lethal, but some armies are skilled and some armies have not, the result has been little change in the median outcome of warfare, but a big increase in variance. And there's reason to expect that we'll see the same thing at sea. If we look at a couple of centuries of naval experience through the nav battle data, and we compare the median loss exchange ratio over time by century, what we see is no clear statistically significant pattern. If we look at the variance, however, in loss exchange ratio by century, we see a progressive increase in the variability of military outcomes at sea that in all probability is a consequence of the difference between skilled navies and unskilled navies. And what that suggests is the expectation that future warfare in the Western Pacific is going to make it virtually impossible to quickly destroy preemptively an opponent's A2AD system is premised on an expectation of equal skill between the US military and the Chinese military. And that leads to a couple of implications that I'll sketch briefly before Charlie gives me the hook. One implication for policy, one implication for scholarship. Dissertation writers out there, be alert. On the policy side of things, this kind of relationship suggests that paramount importance of skilled use of technology by combatants, lest your exposure at sea result in a radically one-sided result with very little ability to affect what's happening on land. And there are important reasons to be worried about the degree to which the US Navy has been able to retain its historic skill level in the face of a very high tempo of operations with a fleet of diminishing size. Policy implication number one following from this, other than the kind of expectation that we're headed for a partition of the Western Pacific into spheres of influence looks even more likely in historical context. The second policy implication is that's dependent on a particular claim that we can produce skilled behavior by the US military in an environment in which there may be reasons to worry about whether or not we have retained this. I give you the case of collisions at sea in the Pacific in the last 12 months. But there's also an implication for dissertation writers and other academics and researchers among us, which is it's important that the United States retain skill. It's also important that we understand what skill level we can expect from the Chinese. And that's an area where there's tremendous potential opportunity to take a variety of ideas that have been developed in the military effectiveness literature about the causes of skill with respect to continental warfare and ask to what degree do these travel into the maritime domain? Some probably will. The effects of GDP per capita or the effects of human capital, for instance, which have been much analyzed in the military effectiveness literature on land, probably have similar effects at sea. Others are very unlikely to have the same effects. Civil-military relations has been much discussed, for example, as a determinant of military effectiveness on land. The disutility of navies for coup d'etat suggests that it may very well be the case that regimes that are not willing to professionalize their armies may be willing to professionalize their navies because they're less of a threat to the regime. Navies have classically been drawn from different social strata, different ethnic subpopulations, and trained according to different criteria than land armies. it's entirely possible that there are a collection of variables that have been much talked about in the political science literature on effectiveness on land that will be very different at sea. The stakes here are very large in anticipating what China is going to be able to do. Dissertations to be written in there somewhere.
Alex, you're next. Sorry.
Dissertation writers just ran out of the room.
Oh, well. They're off to start writing,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Where's the clicker? Come back here with that? Good afternoon. My name is Alex Downs. I teach here at GW. And on behalf of my co-authors, Charlie Glazer, Jasen Castillo, I'm going to talk about, for the next 20, 25 minutes, a paper we've been working on, yeah, I know, about nuclear compellence, rethinking the effects of the bomb. This paper doesn't really have a counterpart in the first stage of this project. This is more in the, we got agitated about this and decided to work on it. And it fit very nicely with the themes of the project. Right, so the question that we're trying to answer in this project is, when does the possession of nuclear weapons affect a state's ability to compel concessions? Right, so we're talking about compellence here, compel concessions from adversaries. And the existing answers that are out there, of which I have props, right? This is basically Koenig's new volume from Oxford, the Sexer and Furman volume from Cambridge from last year, have a bit of a taste great, less filling flavor to them, in the sense that, you know, one is really nuclear weapons are great, they help you win. The other is, nuclear weapons really don't buy you anything in terms of coercion or compellence. We were dissatisfied with this literature for a number of reasons I'll go into later. One is, well, it doesn't really ever define what nuclear compellence is. And it sort of buys into this argument that nuclear weapons matter all the time, when they probably don't. Why this matters, other than an academic debate? Well, what you think about this matters a lot for where you come down on proliferation, right? If you think nuclear weapons, nuclear superiority helps a lot for getting your way in international politics, right? You're gonna be very concerned about other countries getting nuclear weapons. It determines what you think about the US nuclear arsenal, right? If that helps, if a big nuclear arsenal helps us get our way, more nukes, good, right? If it doesn't, well, don't needn't be so concerned about that. And then more academically, right, what do you think about the status of the effect of power in getting your way in international politics? We used to think that, well, if you have more capability to carry out your threat, that's good, right? But there's a recent trend in thinking on this that says, no, more power is bad because your target thinks you're going to come back for a second bite at the apple. So they have incentives to resist now. So what's our answer to this? Our answer is it depends, right? On what? Couple of things, right? First, we start out by thinking of the variables that are going to affect when nuclear compellence is going to happen and when it will be more likely to work, right? And we identify 5 variables here: the challenger's interests, the relative interest between the challenger and the target, the conventional balance, the nuclear balance, and then the challenger's normative commitments, right? Are they sort of normatively committed to not using nuclear weapons first? We're going to argue that nuclear threats are unlikely to be made and they're unlikely to succeed when the challenger has low stakes. It has a disadvantage in stakes relative to the target. It has a conventional advantage, right? Because you can achieve what you want conventionally. Why would you use nuclear weapons? And you are believer in the nuclear taboo or norms against first use. Whereas on the flip side, threats are going to be more likely to be made and more likely to work when the challenger has higher stakes, maybe even higher stakes than the target, is disadvantaged conventionally, doesn't have a conventional advantage, and doesn't accept these normative ideas against using nuclear weapons. The second thing we think it depends upon is the context in which the threats are made. What do I mean by that? Right, as you heard this morning, nuclear war, nuclear use, threats, doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not a bolt from the blue, right? And depending on when the threat is made, the target may already have considered certain of those variables that we talked about, right? If a nuclear threat emerges out of a conventional war, for example, the target's obviously going to have thought about the conventional balance, and so that's not going to have much influence on their thinking. Particularly important is to think about what the length of the shadow is that nuclear weapons cast over the crisis, right? If nuclear weapons matter all the time, like people seem to think they do, they cast a very long shadow. States are going to have already taken them into consideration when deciding to resist a threat. Therefore, the nuclear balance is going to have not a huge impact on the crisis as it develops, because the challenger's already decided, the target's already decided to resist, taking that into account. Whereas if nuclear weapons cast no shadow, right, the target really hasn't thought about it, a nuclear threat conveys new information, right? So in addition to updating about your assessment of the challenger's interests, you now have to take the nuclear balance into consideration, and it might have a stronger effect. And so decisions about whether to make threats or resist threats send signals about each side's stakes in the crisis, their resolve, and that's going to help determine outcomes in combination with the nuclear balance. So just in case you fall asleep in the next 15 minutes, right, here's the key takeaways from our presentation. First, nuclear compellence is an episode in which a nuclear-armed challenger makes a demand of a target state, and then for a change in the status quo, and makes some kind of implicit or explicit nuclear threat to back it up. There have been a few cases of nuclear compellence. I'll go into this. We argue that 5 variables impact the likelihood of success that I talked about. In particular, the effect of the nuclear balance is going to depend on whether the target's really taken the balance into account or not earlier on when deciding to resist in the first place. And in general, the effect of nuclear weapons will be inversely related in a crisis, inversely related to how much they mattered beforehand. Right? So if you've already thought a lot about them and taken them into account as the crisis progresses, that's not giving you new information. And finally, it's extremely difficult to determine when nuclear compellence will succeed, because it depends on measuring things like stakes and interests and relative interests, and it's hazardous to draw conclusions from the historical record. Why? Well, there are a few cases to draw on. Most of those cases are failures, but it could be that the theory predicts failure in those cases, and future cases may not resemble the past, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end. Okay, so quick roadmap. I can talk a little bit about the existing literature, define what we mean by nuclear compellence, talk about our theory, and then wrap up. Can I? Okay, great. Okay, so the literature. Basically divided between nuclear optimists and pessimists. Optimists think that having more nuclear weapons than your adversary increases the likelihood that you'll prevail. There's a couple of different flavors here. The absolutists say, well, if I have nukes and you don't, that gives me an advantage. But if you have them too, my advantage is negated. Others think that, well, if I have more, if we both have nuclear weapons, but I have more than you, that's going to give me an advantage in crisis bargaining, because the size of arsenals, relative size of arsenals, translates directly into resolve. And therefore, even at high levels, or even when we have thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons, the side that has more is going to have an advantage. Pessimists say, no, possessing more nuclear weapons doesn't give you really any compelling advantage. Why not? They give 3 reasons. One is that the challenger usually has sufficient conventional capabilities to do the job. Second, the cost to compeller of using nuclear weapons would be substantial. Costs here conceptualized as approbation, sanctions, losing allies, things like this. And it's not a normative, like we think it's wrong to use nuclear weapons. We will suffer costs for using them. And the challenger rarely has important interests at stake. Furthermore, brinksmanship is unpalatable and ineffective. Leaders don't like to delegate control. They like to hold on to control when nuclear weapons might be flying around. And signals often just get missed. When you try to send signals in brinksmanship, they just get misinterpreted or missed altogether. All right, so what are some issues with this literature? One is that there's really no agreement on what's being explained, like what's nuclear compellence. Optimists look at the outcome of international crises as measured by the International Crisis Behavior Data Set. Pessimists look at militarized compellant threats, so when states make a compellant threat and backed by the use of force. There's really no agreement sort of on what the dependent variable is here. So if you win an international crisis, that's a victory that's successful nuclear compellence. If you're a nuclear state that makes a compellant threat and you get your way, that's successful nuclear compellence. So there's very different things being talked about here. The second is that pretty much across the board, the argument here is that nuclear weapons always affect outcomes all the time, whether states do anything to make them relevant in a crisis or not. So they're living in what I call NHTSA world, right? NHTSA back in the 50s said, nuclear weapons is such a big deal, they're going to affect every crisis war from here on out. And so nuclear weapons are always going to matter. That has undesirable impact on the universe of cases, right? Because you start to get cases like these, right? The Soviet victory in the Afghan crisis, right, is due to its superior nuclear arsenal. Okay? Successful British, American, French threats against the Bosnian Serbs in 1993, 1994 were due to their nuclear arsenal. No, nuclear arsenal was not relevant, right? This seems like cuckoo crazy land, all right? Finally, some of the data sets that are used here they're not designed with compellence in mind, so you get, they often don't contain any threats of any kind. They contain deterrent and compellant threats, but they don't make any difference between them. And the outcome variable is often unrelated to the outcome of the threat. So not some problems there. So what do we mean when we talk about nuclear compellence, right? We say this is a situation in which a nuclear armed state makes a demand for change in the material status quo from a target and threatens to use a nuclear weapon in case of noncompliance. Right, so there's really three things going on here. One, you gotta have a nuclear weapon, right, to make a threat like this. You gotta make some kind of compellant demand where you're trying to get the other side to make a change in the material status quo. You can be very explicit in writing or speech about what you want that to be, or it can emerge sort of from context. So we're fairly permissive in our definition there. And then the challenger has to do something to make nuclear weapons relevant, right? They have to make a threat to use them, either explicitly, like Khrushchev used to do, he was very blunt in his nuclear threats, or you can do things with your nuclear arsenal. You can raise your nuclear alert status. You can make delivery vehicles to warheads. You can put nuclear armed bombers in the air, some kind of nuclear signal, right? You can do nuclear tests and so on. We acknowledge that there are potential exceptions here where the gravity of the situation is so large with a nuclear armed state or two nuclear armed states that nuclear weapons may not need to be brandished explicitly to make them relevant and for nuclear compellence to be occurring. These cases are fortunately very rare. But say a major conventional war involving a nuclear armed state, these would be what we're going to call full shadow cases, where you may not need to make any explicit demand or threat for a nuclear weapon to be relevant. So going through existing studies, this is kind of what you find in terms of how many cases like that are there in the current studies, right? These are, the Beardsley-Nassau uses international crises where any state has nuclear weapons. Koenig is same with both sides. There's nuclear weapons present on both sides of the crisis. Sexer and Furman use militarized compellant threats. And what you find is, about 1 in 6 cases in the first one consist of nuclear compellence. 1 in 5, 1 in 7. It's not very many full-blown cases of what we think of as nuclear compellence here. There's a lot of nuclear states getting involved in crises or making threats here, but not nuclear compellence. So what are those cases, right? So I'll throw this up here. This is mainly for, what I really want to draw your attention to is The number of asterisks over there, which are for cases, sort of marginal cases where it's not clear that there were real threats made or the threats were understood, and the bolded cases, which I think are our take on what the most serious and clear cases of nuclear compellence are. So you get a lot of cases where, you know, well, we may have made a threat, but the threat wasn't actually communicated, right? The Korean War case is a good one where Dulles supposedly told Nehru that if the Chinese are more reasonable on the prisoner of war issue, we're going to escalate with nuclear weapons. Nehru says, he never told me that, and I certainly never told the Chinese that, so that's cuckoo. So we think that, and the outcome variable I'm less invested in right now. This is all, I should say, work in progress, so things can change. This is the state of our thinking as of yesterday afternoon. So what I'm really concerned to show here is this, right, that the number of cases is really small when you really boil it down, right? And the success rate is also low, but what I really am interested in saying is there's not 100 cases, there's not 50 cases, there's not even 20 cases, right? And this is not a quant versus qualitative thing, right? This is a what are the relevant cases to study? And to study the effects of something, you need to study cases where that thing is happening, not lots of other things. Okay. So key takeaways from the data. There are a few cases of nuclear compellence. Existing cases tend to support the pessimist view, although success is possible. In failures, you look at them, the challengers didn't have an obvious advantage in relative interest. And there's no clear effect for the nuclear balance on outcomes, right? Everybody has failed, whether they had an advantage in arsenal size or disadvantage. Right. Let me say a few words about our theory. 3 minutes.
You can have 2 extra.
Boom, boom, boom. So I went over these before. There's a lot going on under the hood in this paper, right? It's kind of sprawling. So I'm not going to go through a lot of this in detail, right? We think that these 5 things matter, right? When you have, when the challenger has low stakes, they're going to be unlikely to issue a nuclear threat, first of all, and it's not likely to be taken very seriously, right? If the target believes that you're constrained by the nuclear taboo, well, in low stakes cases, they're not going to take your threat seriously. But if you make a threat, then they are going to take you more seriously, right? Because you, despite the fact that you believe in the nuclear taboo, you made a nuclear threat, which conveys how serious maybe you think the situation is. The conventional balance, right? If the challenger has a huge conventional edge, the target's going to say, why would they use nuclear weapons? Not going to take that very seriously. The nuclear balance, right? Under the threshold of MAD, or secure second strike arsenals, having more will make your threat more credible. But once you reach that threshold where both sides, damage doesn't increase that much with numbers, then the threats will be less credible. And then the balance of interests, right? What's the interest of the challenger relative to the target? And obviously, when it favors the challenger, threats will be more credible. When it doesn't, the opposite will be true. We think of nuclear threats as emerging from a potentially three-step process, right? In the phase 1, the challenger makes a demand. The other side decides whether to accept it or not. In the second phase, the challenger can then choose between backing down, going to conventional war, or making a nuclear threat. And then, if in the case of conventional war, then the challenger can decide to make a nuclear threat as well. And if you're interested, it looks like this, right? There's no formal model in this paper. This is purely informal. But that's what it looks like. And let me skip ahead a little bit to get to the key takeaways, right, from the theory and the model. Under very common combinations of variables, the target's not going to perceive a crisis as nuclear at all, right? If the challenger has low interests, or it's a norm-abiding state, or if it has a major conventional advantage, nuclear weapons are not going to be, it's not going to be a nuclear crisis, right? So just like, the famous Nicaragua MiG-21s phantom case, right? Or the Kosovo War, these are not nuclear crises. They're not nuclear threats. Cases in which nuclear weapons should matter from the beginning are relatively rare, right? And you can imagine what those cases would be. Challengers have really important interests, or they don't abide by norms, or they face a conventional disadvantage, and so on. Or there's a serious conventional war going on between the two states, right? Those are relatively rare cases. We can say which factors will influence nuclear compelling outcomes, but making point predictions is hard, right? You can say, well, challengers that accept the nuclear taboo have important interests at stake, an advantage in relative interests, and a nuclear advantage. Boy, they're likely to make credible threats. But, it's hard to say whether that's going to succeed because, hey, your big nuclear advantage might be offset by a target that has a higher resolve, right? In general, the nuclear balance has a greater effect on outcomes when there is no nuclear shadow, right? When the target hasn't considered that there would be a nuclear threat involved at all, than when nukes are thought to matter all the time. And the key effect of escalation and making threats and resisting threats in this model is to convey information about interests and relative interests, like who's sort of more resolved in the case. Successes have been rare, but the theory explains conditions under which you would get success, right? Where the threat should be perceived as credible. And it's not hard to imagine what some of those cases might be, right? I'll just throw these up here and talk about the one that's most relevant to today, right? Which is say the United States gets into a war with China over Taiwan, and the Chinese issue a nuclear threat, say stop fighting in this war, get out of it. And so optimists would say that's not going to be credible because they have a nuclear disadvantage. The pessimists would say, well, it's not really clear. They have a strong interest, but there would be a lot of costs if they use nuclear weapons. We would say the Chinese have a very strong interest in Taiwan, larger than the US interest. They're at a conventional disadvantage, right? Maybe they respect the taboo or not, but I would say they have a strong no first use policy, so they make the threat, we're going to take it more seriously. That's the kind of threat that we would think about as being relatively credible. And it's not hard to think about future scenarios where this might happen. I can talk about those in Q&A. So just to wrap up, thus far the debate's been kind of taste great, less filling. We try to do three things, right? We say, let's define what nuclear compellence is, offer a theory of the conditions under which we would expect nuclear compellence to succeed or fail, and then try to think carefully about sequencing and selection effects, like when variables are going to matter at which stages of the crisis. The result is clarifying and confusing and complicated. It's clarifying in terms of what cases we should be studying. It's clarifying on what variables we should be looking at, but explaining success is complicated, right? Because it's hard to assess variables like interests and relative interests, right? It's in some ways easier to posit a hypothetical scenario and say, aha, well, we know Chinese interests over Taiwan would be really strong, ... But saying who had the stronger interest in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States or the Soviets? Right? Not super obvious on the face of it. So we agree with the pessimists that success has been relatively rare, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fail in the future, right? And that's why it's important to have a theory that can explain that variation. Thank you very much.
All right, and now for something completely different.
This is the potpourri.
Hi, my name is Lizabeth Saunders. My role in this project is not as an area expert, but as a scholar of domestic politics and international relations. And so I'm going to be doing something a little different from most of the papers you've seen thus far. But one thing that is the same is that I want to share in my colleagues' thanks to the Carnegie Corporation for funding this project and also to Charlie for leading it and for the opportunity to work on this. So most of what we talked about thus far today has been quite rightly about the geopolitical interactions that either we've seen in the past or that we're thinking about in the future in the U.S.-China relationship. But we also know that we're talking about states and state leaders that face their own domestic political dynamics. And so what I want to talk about today is the paper that I'm working on for this project, which sort of takes stock of what we've learned in IR about domestic politics and nuclear security and tries to sort of put it into a framework that helps to understand and illuminate these cases from a domestic political perspective and sort of evaluate, like, when do the domestic politics really matter and when might security imperatives dominate. And so what I'm going to do is come back to the U.S.-China implications of the paper at the very end. But I also will talk along the way about two cases that, of course, have been much in the news and that are very much at the forefront of all of our thoughts these days, which is the upcoming talks between Trump and Kim with respect to the North Korean nuclear program. And of course, the soon-to-be-decided fate of the Iran deal, and with the upcoming deadline of May 12th for the U.S. to recertify it. And the news this week emerging from the talks between French President Emmanuel Macron and President Trump, which at first seemed to suggest a renegotiation, and now Macron has basically said, yes, he thinks he's going to pull out. So clearly lots going on in this realm, and I think it's just always important to bear in mind that there's a lot of domestic politics, as Alex put it, sort of going on under the hood here. So we have learned a tremendous amount in the last decade or so about domestic politics and nuclear policy. There's been a lot of new research in this area, and just to sort of smattering, just to give you a flavor of this, some of the findings that we've had, there's been a lot of excellent work on nuclear policy in authoritarian regimes. So, for example, Malfred Braut-Heghammer's book looks at variation within personalist dictatorships that have tried to get the bomb, including Iraq and Libya. Civil-military relations and nuclear strategy, so thinking here of Vipin Narang's work, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. On the Democratic side, we've got new work on public opinion and nuclear use, so some work that's been done by Daryl Press, Scott Sagan, and Ben Valentino. Work on leaders in nuclear policy, and this is very interesting because it's been done both on the U.S. side, where we're sort of more used to studying leaders and presidents. That's where some of my own previous research has been. And one of our GW PhD graduates who did very interesting work on this is Rachel Whitlark, who looked at variation in presidential beliefs about nuclear threats. There's also been very interesting work on the Chinese side in this area, and Taylor Fravel, of course, has done some of this work. Taylor and Fiona have done work on this, and Chinese nuclear beliefs and how they really continue to shape Chinese nuclear policy. And finally, some of my current research with Sarah Krebs of Cornell and Ken Schultz of Stanford, looking at partisan constraints on arms control, differences between the parties and how they're able politically to get arms control treaties ratified. So just a smattering, that's certainly not an exhaustive list, but that's some of what we know and have learned in the last decade or so. And I think that this sort of pushing forward in the literature really comes from two big developments. One is that scholars have really expanded the nuclear timeline. So it used to be that we thought of nuclear proliferation in a very binary way. Either you had the bomb or you didn't. And now we have a much more nuanced understanding of both before the point of proliferation, so the concept of nuclear latency. One of our other GW PhD students, Tristan Volpe, has done very good work in this area, and the different paths that states take to proliferation. And we also know a lot more about what happens after proliferation. So work on nuclear posture, nuclear strategy, nuclear coercion, obviously what the paper you just heard looked at that. Counter-proliferation, so this is Rachel Whitlark's work. How do states approach the problem of trying to prevent other states from getting the bomb? And then finally, new approaches to thinking about arms control, which is obviously not, there's been lots of older work on that, but there's been a bit of a revival of interest in that as well. So this unpacking of the nuclear timeline, I think, opens up a lot more places where domestic politics can come into play. The second development is that there's been a lot of new research on regime type in IR. In previous work on nuclear policy and domestic politics, you often would find that scholars would put in a dummy variable into a regression for whether or not a state was a democracy, and it would turn up insignificant. And from that, you would conclude that domestic politics didn't really matter that much. And that approach, by the way, is not unique to the nuclear security literature. This happens all over IR. And so people would sort of pick up their toys and go home and say, well, you know, it doesn't really matter. But we now have a far more nuanced understanding of regime type, and we tend not to put dummy variables in for democracies anymore. And in particular, we've really, in the last 10 years, seen an explosion of work unpacking non-democracies. So it used to be that all non-democracies were kind of put into a residual category and just treated as one sort of bin of countries. And now we certainly have a lot more work that has distinguished, say, personalist dictatorships from other types of authoritarian regimes. Caitlin Talmadge's book does an excellent job looking at the military effectiveness of personalist dictators and so forth. And we sort of have a better sense that there's really politics everywhere, including in all ends of the authoritarian spectrum. There's also been important work looking at variation in democracies. And we now know that there's a significant variation in the constraint that democratic leaders are under, how centralized policy is across issue areas, and the degree to which democracies use secrecy. And then a sort of final development in this area has been a focus on leaders really across regime types. And so now we're able to look at the effects of leaders both within their own regime types and across, and to try to find the commonalities in the way that leaders think about retaining power and the costs of opening up policy to discussion that really can sometimes, you can sometimes find commonalities across leaders in democracies and dictatorships. And one sort of third development, and maybe this deserves its own slide, but I do think it's important to note that one reason we've been able to make these leaps is, and this is particularly true in the nuclear arena, we now have a lot more archival documentation, a lot more interview data. You heard some of that in the presentations this morning, for example, on the Chinese side. But there's been a lot more scholarship that has allowed us to actually see into some of these processes in authoritarian regimes in particular, right? Even including in places like Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Gaddafi's Libya. And I think that's really gone a long way to sort of moving away from the US focus and the democracy focus of a lot of the previous generation of literature that looked at domestic politics and nuclear security. So what have we learned from this? So one thing that this paper is trying to do is to say, well, not all domestic political arguments are the same, and they're not always operative, and how can we sort of make sense of all these different arguments that the literature has sort of thrown up? So what kind of domestic politics are we talking about? Well, in the nuclear security literature, the previous generation, a lot of the arguments were what I'd call bottom-up, right? So these are kind of arguments like grassroots pressure for arms control. Bureaucratic constraints, that bureaucratic stakeholders pushing for particular policies or acting as sort of veto players. Technology that may be sort of come out of the nuclear complex, sort of putting a constraint from the bottom up on political leaders. So I would classify most of those as sort of coming from the bottom up. The other sort of set of arguments are more top down. So starting from leaders and elites and assertive control over institutions. And what I would say is that most of the recent sort of round of domestic political arguments in this field are in some way top down. That's what they have in common. They have a lot of things that are different about them, but that's what they mostly have in common. So what do I mean by this? A lot of the types of things that these questions are examining is how wide is the circle of decision makers? What steps do leaders take to control the circle? So it's often the case that leaders are trying to centralize policy. Fiona and Taylor talked this morning about how the Chinese have taken steps to decouple nuclear policy from conventional policy and really silo off nuclear policy from other parts of the PLA. That doesn't happen by accident, right? That often happens because leaders take deliberate steps to limit, design institutions a certain way or limit access, control the flow of information, right? That's a top-down kind of argument. So what steps are leaders taking to control the circle of people and institutions that have access to policymaking? And Jacques Hyman, who wrote a very interesting book on leaders and proliferation in 2006, makes the argument that proliferation is a leap in the dark, as he puts it, that requires top-down political direction. And that is a feature, I think, that a lot of these arguments have in common, right? They're saying that top-down direction is necessary to understand why the politics around nuclear decision-making are set up the way they are. For scholars, that's a real challenge, though, because it's very hard to necessarily observe a lot of these processes when they are strategic, when they've been done in an authoritarian context behind closed doors. And that's one of the reasons why access to this new documentation is so useful and so important for our understanding in this literature. It's also the case that we obviously know that security imperatives still dominate nuclear decisions, and so we want to have some sense of how these factors interact. When do we expect that domestic political factors will be important, and when might they actually not, or when might they be sort of a secondary factor that may affect the outcome, but that are really driven by initially security imperatives? Okay, so here what I'm doing is taking the cue from a lot of recent arguments more broadly in IR that sort of have leaders balancing internal and external threats, right? So again, taking my cue from Caitlin's excellent work, showing that in the sort of conventional military effectiveness realm, leaders often do things like coup-proof their militaries, and that can really undermine military effectiveness, and they aren't going to undo those things until the enemy is sort of figuratively or literally at the palace gates, right? The internal really matters. The internal threats really matters and can sometimes actually trump external threats. So how in the nuclear context can we try to understand this? So in this paper, I look at two dimensions of policy. One, focusing on the internal side, is what I call the costs of audience expansion. So what does it cost a leader to open up nuclear policy, to decentralize it, to allow more people to have a say, to build a new institution? To make a nuclear weapon, to operate, to have a functional nuclear policy requires delegating, making institutions that can manufacture the weapons, and we know that a lot of these things require expanding the audience that has access to the policy. But that can also impose costs on leaders. So we're talking here about the circle of actors that can observe the decision and impose costs on leaders. And some of the examples of costs come from civil-military relations. So if you give them military control over things, they can sometimes use it to come back and in the limit, initiate a coup. That's not good if you're the leader. In the democratic context, you can have partisan politics, and I certainly do mean partisan politics in the way that we experience it here in the United States, but this can come in a variety of other forms. It could be that the very decision to get the bomb is such a sensitive issue, and this is certainly the case, for example, in India, that leaders decide to keep it a very closely held secret, lest it be held against them by the opposition party. So a variety of ways that both democracies and autocracies, right? It's important to know that these costs can be felt by democratic leaders and autocratic leaders, will feel the costs of letting more people into the nuclear sort of club, or decision-making club. Again, both democracies and autocracies can face these costs. The second dimension is from the external international environment. That has to do with the clarity or ambiguity of the threats that the state faces. And we think of threats as being really clear, but they're often very much up for debate. And the sources of threat ambiguity are many. Some examples include just basic uncertainty about the adversary's intentions or capabilities. What do they have? What stage is the Iranian nuclear program? There's obviously a lot of debate about that in the past. The credibility of a major power security guarantee. We've talked a lot about that already, and there can be uncertainty about that. There can be debate over what the current state of play really is. And you can have debates, say, within democracies over the utility of nuclear weapons, the type and extent of capabilities that are required, and that can throw up uncertainty for other states that are looking at those debates and wondering, well, okay, well, what is their trajectory, right? And so how can we respond seeing these debates unfolding at home? So it is often the case that threats are ambiguous, and where you have threat ambiguity, You may then have a set of domestic actors with very different preferences. And then you have to think about how to generate consensus from the people who may have different beliefs and preferences over what to do. I should have said also, another source of threat ambiguity can be leaders' beliefs about nuclear threats. And again, to the extent you have divergence in views, you then have to think about, well, am I giving political power or bureaucratic power to actors with different preferences and beliefs? So here I have the famous political science 2x2. So what I've done here is I put these two dimensions together. And I think this is highly, highly oversimplified, but we're political scientists, so we traffic sort of our job to make gross oversimplifications. It's what we're paid to do. And I think this at least gives some sort of guidance for understanding how the sort of balance between internal and external threats might play out. So first, just let's look at this column over here, the threat ambiguity, right? So here's where there's a lot of debate potentially over how serious the threat really is. When the costs of audience expansion are high, you have what I call centralizers, right? So these are leaders who just don't really want to let other actors in. They want to keep nuclear decision-making very, very close to the vest. Vipin Naring's book points out that it makes very clear that you can have centralizers in democracies and you can have centralizers in autocracies, right? China has famously kept its nuclear policy highly, highly centralized, even within its own military. Early nuclear policy in India, same thing, right? Highly secretive, very much kept under tight control. So what I think is interesting about this is the box where you really can expect to find leader beliefs mattering a lot, right? The central leader is really going to have a lot of sway over nuclear policy in an environment of ambiguous threats and where the costs of audience expansion are high. Where the cost of audience expansion is relatively low, you would have, but you still have relatively ambiguous threats, you have what I call mobilizers, right? These are leaders who see some benefit to expanding the circle of decision makers or stakeholders, possibly because they want to tie future leaders' hands, right? So if you think about treaty ratification, that's one of the reasons why you would bother to get the other party to buy in to treaty ratification, which takes time and political capital. Why would you bother, right? It's because you would like to be able to make sure that that policy sticks. And I'll come back to that when we talk about the Iran deal, right? Because that's part of the problem with what's happening with the Iran deal right now. So it's often the case that the benefits of audience expansion may outweigh the costs, right? And there are other examples I could talk about in that box, but I think that I'll just leave it there for now. I'm so bad with my right and my left. On your right, in the threat clarity column, that's where you're at the palace. The enemy's at the palace gates, right? So there's not a whole lot of ambiguity anymore about the threat. But you do still have differences in how costly it is to have an expanded audience, right? Where you finally realize you had better expand your audience or you're gonna be overrun, you have what I would call crashers, right? These are leaders who say, okay, we better get a nuclear weapon or we better do something like delegate authority very quickly, right? The problem is they're gonna be doing it very reluctantly and under duress. And that may have consequences, right? Leaders that don't have a lot of, or countries that don't have a lot of experience with delegation, if they do it rapidly, are much more likely to make some sort of catastrophic mistake. It increases the risk. If we think to Caitlin's presentation this morning, if we get into a war, conventional war with China that suddenly becomes, escalates into the nuclear realm and you have loss of sort of command and control, or China decides to sort of delegate command and control sort of on the fly, that's highly risky as opposed to the United States, which has far more experience over the decades with pre-delegated command and control. Where costs of audience expansion are low and the threat is pretty clear, then you have what I would call delegators, where you're doing this under sort of a much more routinized, orderly fashion, expanding the audience, delegating, and so forth. Okay, so what does this do to help? How does this help us understand what's going on in North Korea, with the Iran deal, and finally with China? In the case of North Korea, which I think has sort of exploded this idea that weak and poor countries can't, develop pretty sophisticated nuclear arsenals, we have Kim facing a pretty acute security threat and ambiguity in Beijing's patronage. And so in the beginning of his control, he spends a lot of time consolidating power, but he's pretty well consolidated because we know that because we saw that he was willing to actually leave Pyongyang and go to Beijing recently, which is a pretty big signal. He seems to, along the way, have shielded the scientists, right? So he has calculated that it was worth it to delegate enough authority and protect the scientific community to develop this weapon. The question, I think, is he going to become a sort of a crasher when we get to the question of command and control, right? How much power is Kim really going to be willing to delegate in North Korea's command and control? And again, that gets into the question of how orderly that process is going to be and how much risk that induces if you start talking about what might actually happen in a nuclear crisis. I think the Iran deal really drives home that these domestic political dynamics are not unique to U.S. adversaries, right? The Iran deal, the source of the political uncertainty is really coming from the United States. On the U.S. side, political polarization has really led to a centralizing of nuclear policymaking, right? The JCPOA was made as an executive agreement rather than a treaty. And in fact, John Kerry, when he went to the Hill to explain this, basically said, you can't get a treaty anymore. It's just not possible to get the votes from the other side. And some of the work that I've done with Sarah Krebs and Ken Schultz looks at, what side payments are required to get votes from the opposition party, and polarization essentially has the effect of just increasing the size of that side payment to the point where it may be untenable. So the uncertainty here stems from leadership and partisan turnover. And so then what you have is leaders sort of deciding, well, the costs of bringing the other side on board are not worth it anymore. So I'll centralize policy, and you see I would put Obama in that sort of centralizer box. The downside, of course, is that those policies become less sticky, and I think that's what we're really seeing. Just yesterday, Brian Hook, the director of policy planning for President Trump, went on NPR and said of the Iran deal, it has no signatures, it has no legal status, it's a political commitment by an administration that's no longer in office, right? That is the direct effect of partisan turnover. Finally, I'll just wrap up with implications for U.S.-China nuclear policy, right? Partisan politics in the United States. It's going to be a lot harder than it might have been even in the days of the Soviet Union to mobilize domestic support for binding cooperation with China, right? Such as arms control, if we ever got to that point. And some of the work that I've done with Sarah Krebs and Ken Schultz makes the argument that this can be even harder for Democrats than it would be for Republicans. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but I've already sort of mentioned civil-military relations in China. China, as Taylor and Fiona have argued, really try to centralize their nuclear policy, but if they have to delegate under duress in a sort of crasher scenario, that potentially would increase risk. Finally, nuclear policy in China is already very centralized. We know that, but politics in China are in the process of themselves centralizing under Xi. And so that raises the question of whether Xi's nuclear beliefs are different and what their role might be in Chinese nuclear policy going forward. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions.